Washington has some major concerns in defensive line recruiting.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back in to another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He writes with me over at Huskies Wire. Thanks for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. And just a quick reminder to all the everydayers out there, wherever you get this podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, make sure to click that subscribe button, click the little bell as well, so you don't miss when we post a new video. And if you're on the audio only side of things, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review, as it does all help us out a lot. Now, Lars, we got a whole lot to get into today. We're going to, get to it at the end, but we're going to talk about how Washington's class could get back on track, because we need to spend a lot of time talking about some of the major concerns in defensive line recruiting. Over the last couple of weeks now, we've seen 4-star defensive lineman Khary Wilder commit to Ohio State, 4-star David Schwerzel, UCLA, 3-star Fa Siale at Michigan State, and then on Saturday, 5-star edge rusher Tristian Givens went to Texas A&M. Now, there's a lot of concerns here, because you and I have been very big proponents of you're in on a lot of talented prospects along the defensive line. Now, outside of TI Umu-Cais and Landon Barnes, they've all gone elsewhere.
Yeah, so here's the thing. There's a lot to unpack here. And again, you want to be professional, you want to be respectful, but you also want to call a spade a spade. I think back to the 2025 class, where we liked what Devin Hyde brings in terms of, projectability and things like that. Dominic Macon, all those guys. We like what they were, but none of them were like, the cream of the crop. None of them were the Khary Wilders. None of them were the, TI Umu-Cais. Derek Coleman Bruce. Certainly, and again, also certainly not the Tristian Givens of the world. So you're already better in terms of, at least you're in the discussion, but you're not closing. So that's another problem, but you're at least getting closer to that point. But it does get kind of concerning when you're missing on all the guys. It seems like, where you do have Derek, which again is important, but as I'm going to have, actually, who knows, by the time this comes out, maybe it's on Huskies already, but talking about Logan Coleman Bruce with him moving in this weekend, and you always kind of thought you would get Derek. Again, there's maybe a few mitigating circumstances as to how Derek ended up at Washington and the timing and all that, but it always kind of seemed like Derek was going to stay home. So you at least get that one, but barring TI Umu-Cais and maybe a surprise here and there, you're looking at thinking like, you're kind of going to that 25 class again, where, hey, it's projectability, it's development, it's all that. But in order to be in that top 15 class, you need to have some of those cream of the crop guys.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about getting an instant impact kind of player, which if Tristian Givens does end up choosing Washington, he would certainly have been that. I think that Derek Coleman Bruce absolutely can and will be that for you going next year. When you look at just where he is right now physically and in terms of his development, I think you have one there, but the whole point was getting more. And if you get TI Umu-Cais, who we'll talk a lot more about later on, that would certainly be a step in the right direction. But after miss after miss after miss after miss, you can't help but sit here and be a little concerned when you went out and showed how vital it was to add depth and talent just to your defensive line through the transfer portal, by going and getting Taitaui Uiagalelei, by going and getting Simone Peppa and Antario Thompson to all bolster the interior of the defensive line. And that's great. And honestly, I look at where you are right now when, a guy like Dakota Dickson, who ended up committing to SMU, who was supposed to visit over this past weekend. I think that that's another one where if you take a guy like that, yeah, you really like where you're sitting in terms of long-term. I like the long-term projections that you took in last year in Dominic Macon, Caleb Smith being another one, Victor Sanchez-Hernandez, and Devin Hyde. I think that, you look at the talent evaluation of that particular group and you say, yeah, we're absolutely happy with where that could be year, 2 year, 3 years from now. But with where you're going to be over the next couple of years, it's about continuing to level up, which is something Jedd Fisch has talked about a lot, and about making sure that you are among the cream of the crop in the Big Ten in everything that you're doing. And it showed last year that you needed to level up along the defensive line more than anywhere else, most likely. And that was certainly going to be a big emphasis in high school recruiting. And the fact that you were in on so many of these high caliber guys, and then you go out there and miss on, as of right now, the good majority of them, that is certainly something to be concerned about.
It is, but when again, if we're just going to, It's something where I remember, I don't know if it was exactly on the podcast when Devin Heidi came on and talked with us for, I swear it almost felt like 2 hours because Devin's such a great kid. But it's one of those where Jason Kaufusi, his personality, like when we talk to him, man of not many words when it comes to, the defensive line recruiting and just talking about them in general. And we'll ask about a position or we'll say, hey, what is this guy doing? Oh, he's good. He's big, fast. It's like, again, we know that. Like, what can you offer where, if you take a guy like, Jamarcus Shepard, for example, or even Ryan Grubb to an extent, where I know Ryan Grubb might not seem like like the Jamarcus Shepard type in terms of outgoing personality, but Grubb was a great person to talk to. You could just kind of see, and it's not to say that you can't have a conversation with Kaufusi, because that's what Devin said, where he's like, I didn't really have that close a relationship. Like, obviously we got along, obviously was interested in school and wanted to come up for a visit, but it took having a 3-hour dinner with him the first night of his official visit before he's like, oh, wow, I get it. Now, it's like once you get to know Coach Kaufusi, it's your relationship and your view on him changes, then everything comes together. But for a lot of guys, it's, getting to that point is kind of harder for some guys. And, and it's not to slight Coach Kaufusi, or it's not to say that recruits don't know how to, build relationships. It's neither of the case, but it's also both the case where marrying the two together, that's where, we'll talk about it more next segment, but it's hard to rely on a high school, high-end recruiting when your personality is more shaped towards, hey, I know how to get you to the next level. For example, Anxious Noah, a guy who's been committed to Washington at running back since early April 2024, and maintain that all the way through. Something like that, where you can say it was a developed relationship, one that you had, not necessarily one where it's okay, the coach played, call it, a 5% role in the overall commitment, where it's this guy and this guy and this program and this other factor. It's like, again, which is all kind of important, but or think about Derek Zaman, a quarterback, the personal relationship with Jedd, but also JP Losman, everything being involved there. You have a relationship with all those guys, where it just doesn't feel like that's necessarily always been the case along the defensive line.
So I see where you're going with that. I think Marcus Griffin, the director of recruiting, has done a really good job helping with, relationships. And especially, we've talked about it a lot. His role in the Tristian Givens recruitment loomed very, very large. And that was a big part of all that. But I think that there's two things that can be true at the same time here. Washington has not done a good job closing on some of their top targets. For example, Khary Wilder not taking his official visit and going to Ohio State before he even gets there. I think that can be true. And at the same time, you look at some of these other targets, and I'm not going to, call anybody out here, but since money is a factor with a lot of this now, if you put a certain evaluation on whatever prospect it might be, and you say, this is how we value you, and another school comes in and offers 2, 3, 4 times that money, and you say, no, we're not going to, try to go and just play the money route to make sure you come in, which is going to maybe hamstring you in another area or in somebody else's recruitment. I think both those things can be true, and it still does not look great. I'm not trying to do that to say, oh yeah, that means that you have to go out and overpay for somebody to make sure they come to Washington. No, I'm totally okay with, taking somebody who might be a little underrated in the same light as Dominic Macon was in last year's cycle and finding a way to make that work. But that's not your best course of action with everybody, where if you don't end up hitting on a guy like TI Umu-Cais at this point in time, then this class becomes even more of a major concern. And having Derek Coleman-Brusa committed is fantastic. You did such a great job with that. But it's about adding on and continuing to stack classes, because Lars, Washington is not in a position where you can rely on flips or the transfer portal on a year-in, year-out basis. And we'll get to that right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball, under the lights, just like I am, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling with FanDuel? You can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. I think that's a really fun way to get involved with the Washington Huskies this season as well. The over-under right now for their win total is set at 7.5, and I absolutely love the over. I think the schedule shapes up very, very well with some upgrades on defense, some upgrades on offense as well, adding some guys like Carver Willis and Gieran Hatchett through the transfer portal, plus getting Damon Williams, Jonah Coleman, Denzel Boston going. I absolutely love where the Huskies can go this season with the schedule that lines up pretty well. over 7.5, that seems like a sure thing to me. And if you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So Lars, as we take a more of a deep dive look into this class, it's something that I think you made a very good point about a week or two ago when Khary Wilder did commit to Ohio State. You said, I don't know if this recruitment is necessarily over. You highlighted him maybe coming up for the Ohio State game on September 27th. But this right here, this situation right here is why I pushed back so firm. And I was kind of like, you can't rely on that. You can't ever be in a point where, oh, hey, maybe we'll flip this kid closer to signing day. Maybe you can go out and find a way to get him on campus at a certain point later on in the cycle, where if you do that, I would be the first person to take my hat off and say, you did a really good job finding a way to make that work. And if you do, awesome. But you can never be in a situation where that's what you're relying on, because it's something you put very, very well a month or two ago, where you were talking about what Washington can be as a selling point, especially over the summer when you get kids on campus for an official visit. Washington has traditionally done a very good job on closing the guys that they want, especially at such an important position like what defensive line is right now. It makes those misses even more concerning.
It really, well, it makes it more puzzling, but also, as you said, and kind of as we laid out last segment, it's almost like your coaching and like the personality is more geared towards the transfer portal than it is the high school, development. It's like you have Jedd saying we want to develop through the high school ranks, which is absolutely true and absolutely imperative, especially along the trenches and certainly the defensive line in the Big Ten. But then you have a coach where it's like, I can turn Ontario Thompson into a, all Big Ten potential, whatever, second, third, 14, whatever it ends up being. But, you can turn him into an all Big Ten type of guy. You can turn Tacario Davis, obviously back into his, first, second team, Big Ten status type of player. You can do all these types of things, but it comes with a caveat. Every year you got to take the Kalen DeBoer route of, hey, we need to kind of supplement in the portal. We can take a couple guys. We'll take a Derek and one or two other 3-stars in the class, and then we'll get 3 or 4 transfers, and we'll figure it out as we go. Again, like the Kalen era did produce. I know it's the offensive side more so, but it's like when you hit, but also when you don't hit, it makes it even worse. Like those transfer guys might not actually pop in the same way you think. Logan Sagapalu last season, where we thought we might see him in certain packages more than we did, whereas now it sounds like this season we'll see him. But it's like it's a longer term payoff, and it's not always a guarantee.
Right. I think that's a unique situation where that was his first year playing the defensive line. I hear your analogy there, but I think the more important, more overarching part of this is the transfer portal, where it's something that the transfer portal is great for supplementing pieces or adding, a high-end starter every now and again from the FCS levels, or, in the rare case, a Tacario Davis becomes available and you happen to know the kid pretty well for one reason or another. But it's one of those things where you can't consistently rely on that, where you reference Ontario Thompson. I think that's a great, example to bring up here, because when you look at what a kid like that brings to the table, he had a year of experience at Iowa, and he flashed in terms of what he brings from his strength, from his athleticism, all those measurables. They check out really well, and he, couldn't hang there for one reason or another, drops down to the group of 5 to go get more playing time at Western Michigan, and now he's back for his final season in the Big Ten, and you're going to find a way to make that work. And I think it could end up working out very, very well, especially from everything we've seen from him in particular during spring practice. And that's fine. That's great. If you add, let's just say, one of those guys every single year, I personally don't think that's a bad thing. But 2 things here. A, I don't think that's necessarily the way that Jedd Fisch wants to build his roster. I don't think that's the way defensive coordinator Ryan Walters wants to build his roster. And I also just don't think that that's something that you can just go in and count on every year, because that's what every single team around the country wants to do, especially along the defensive line, where that's the biggest thing we hear is outside of quarterbacks, the 2 position groups that are getting paid the most every single cycle are offensive tackles and defensive linemen. Like, that's just the way that it's working, because everybody in the country is looking for those high impact pass rushers, run stuffers, just somebody who can find a way to make a big time impact in the transfer portal. And B, when those guys are already on your roster, all of a sudden it mitigates the need for having to go out and spend that top dollar in the transfer portal, because it's the thing that comes around from the first segment that I referenced, where if your player evaluation says, we think that this player is worth X amount of dollars in NIL, and we're willing to go, up to Y, but we're not going to match whatever that other school wants to put out, I think that's completely fine. I think that's fair. But all of a sudden in the transfer portal, that's a real slippery slope to go down, and you can't continue to do that.
You can't, but it's one of those cases where when you again look at the developmental side of it, do you take, to use an NFL analogy here, instead of having multiple first round picks, you have that 5th, 6th, 7th round steal that ends up being a 10, 12-year guy in the NFL, ends up being a really good pick, but he had to slide because he was a 3-star or a 2-star, whatever the case may be. And you kind of have to play the good old Chris Peterson card of, hey, we developed a Greg Gaines, a 3-star out of La Habra that nobody. No, again, Villa's the outlier for a couple of reasons here.
But no, hold on. But I bring him up for a reason. I do. Where it's something where you absolutely can sell that if you're, really good at going out and picking out diamonds in the rough, which I think we've seen. And I think we've seen this coaching staff do that at several positions, where if you go back through not just their time at Arizona, but what they've brought up here to Washington, Jonah Coleman is a perfect example of that. Like, yeah, it's a different position, but he's somebody who you picked out as, a mid-ranked 3-star who you've developed into one of the best players in the country. So I think that's a fair example. But the point is, I do believe this coaching staff can go out there and find players like that every single year. I do. I legitimately believe that they can go out and find, maybe not a first round every year, right? But go out and find these guys who, have the potential to be a day 2 NFL selection in 4 or 5 seasons. But the whole point is, when you and I get into talking about like stars, where they do and they don't matter, the whole reason behind, the reason they do is I've seen some everydayers pointed out in the comments that, yeah, it helps their NIL evaluation. And for sure, I agree with that. But the biggest thing is they have that ranking for a reason in terms of their athleticism, their traits, some of these raw abilities that the right coaching staff can, find a way to tap into. And you need to find a way to go out there and develop those things. And it's why, maybe you can go out and take a 5-star guy out of the transfer portal and in a year or two and just say, oh yeah, maybe this guy didn't develop as well as you might hoped of at X school or Y school or whatever. And you can find a way to make that work with your coaching staff. And, it's a nice selling point for you. But when you're getting those kids in the door year in and year out through high school recruiting, because you're selling them on, exactly what we just talked about, that is so much more sustainable than any other route.
You're 100% right, and I'm not trying to truly play devil's advocate because I don't believe it, but also just for the discussion's sake, there's got to be a little bit of pushback. But it's also as you say that, again, if you can get Tristian Givens to flip like Jeremiah Martin did, where it's, hey, I was interested in Washington originally out of high school and didn't work out. Whereas Liatu Latu goes to UCLA and balls out for 2 years after, being the heralded 4-star. So, the football gods are going to come back on you to decide one of these times here. And so you just have to think like the relationships are there, but maybe are the right people in the right places with those right relationships? Because clearly, like we talked about with a few names, you have guys like Marcus Griffin who have good people, the relationships and all those things. And it's not that Kaufusi doesn't, but, like we saw with Jedd this offseason where, Jimmy Doherty is now, going to be doing his own press conference. It's not the Stephen Bill show. It's like, hey, in this new age of recruiting, that
I respect the Freudian slip there. That's great.
But yeah, it's Steve and Brennan. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, there we
go. Hey, both B words. It all works out.
No, it's fantastic.
But kind of the evolution where last season with the foundation, you got to evolve it a little bit this season. You should evolve it a little bit as you move forward each year. Maybe you think about that kind of route, because again, you clearly have the interest of the recruits. It's not that you don't have the ability to pull, but for some reason it's closing, and it's closing time in more ways than one.
No, and that's, just to kind of put a bow on this, because there's 2 things I want to say. You referenced the Tristian Givens, Jeremiah Martin comparison. I think that's a really solid, route to go down. But that's the whole point of what we're saying here, right? Is if that does happen and you are able to do that, that's great. And you're more than happy with that. But for a school like Washington, which, at its peak is a top 10, top 15 program in the country, because we've seen that consistently. We saw it consistently under Chris Peterson. We saw Kalen DeBoer get it back to that. That's not a sustainable strategy. And you should have, and you do. You have all the resources to go out there and sell all of these players. And now whatever the disconnect is there, you've got to find a way to right that. And Lars, I think one way that this coaching staff can right that is by making sure they get a commitment from TI Umu-Cais. So we've had our little rant, which I feel a little bit better now. I do. But we wanted to talk about some positivity here and a couple of ways that Washington can get this, can get this top 15 class back on track, those plans. And there are a bunch of names that you and I kind of threw out there while we were prepping, and we've narrowed it down to 3. The first one that we wanted to talk about was 4-star defensive tackle TI Umu-Cais.
The biggest one. Like, this is the one where, okay, you can miss on Tristian Givens because, again, at the end of the day, in a way like the Brendan Arrington, like, hey, like, it's not an honor just to be nominated, but, like, at least, you're making the effort, you're getting him on campus, those type of things. Then you miss on Schwerzel and a few others, and it's like, ooh, okay. This is the guy where if you miss on TI Umu-Cais, who, as we mentioned, loves Vita Vea. First thing that when I talked to him, his, like, UW, Vita Vea, right, perfect, great. Run with that. Be the next Vita. There's your recruiting pitch. I don't have to do anything. Like, if you miss on TI Umu-Cais, we are going to have an emergency podcast. Like, that's going to be where, like, that's when it is, it's like a 2-alarm fire right now. That immediately goes to a 5-alarm fire. Like, we're skipping the other 3. Like, you're getting right to a 5-alarm fire at that point, because then it's like, that's a guy where clearly, like, whether or not you lucked into the offer at the time you did, so be it. Congrats, Ryan Walters. But with that being said, now you're almost at the finish line. You have to close on TI Umu-Cais.
Absolutely. And it's not even, everything we just spent 20 minutes discussing with the optics and what it's like to build a defensive line in the Big Ten. This is the best defensive tackle west of Texas. It's something we talked about last week. This is something I've had people in multiple recruiting departments tell me that, we're so in on this guy because he is the most developed defensive tackle in this region of the country, where we heard Matt Doherty talk about it at the December signing day press conference last year, where those are really, really hard to come by right now. And if one, as you said, falls into your lap the way that TI Umu-Cais has, you need to find a way to seal the deal. And I do believe that Washington is sitting in a really good spot right now. But for anybody who out there who might be saying, well, I'm uncomfortable with that, with the way the last few weeks have gone, I think that's completely fair. I do. So I wouldn't push back on any of that. But the next guy we wanted to get to is somebody who you and I wanted to have a nice discussion about. And he just came off his official visit, 4-star cornerback Davon Benjamin.
I mean, again, not necessarily the TI Umu-Cais level of like, hey, this would be a significant. It would be a significant loss. I disagree there. No, because I would say it would be a significant loss if for a slightly different characterization there, because this is one where you look at the DB class you have. You just got Jerron Jones recently. This is the one where, again, whether you say Trey McDuffie, whatever name you want to throw out there, this is one where John Richardson can say, I got a Christian Santacario back this season. Let me run it back with 2 lockdown cornerbacks in the 26 class so I can build on top of that. Because, again, by the way, we're talking about, Deion disaster. When you look at the DB room next year, it's like it's open season for whoever wants it. That's out of Rashawn Clark, at least the nickel for certain. Outside, we'll see. But, like, everything
I think the safety's locked down, but that's a discussion for another day.
Again, we're talking about outside quarterbacks here. Davon Benjamin's not a safety. At least last time I checked, we're calling him a cornerback. So with that being said, like this would be the perfect class where John Richardson has everything, where the players in his room, like you mentioned, like Alex often said, he's going to be a DC soon. A bunch of guys believe it, where it's like, and that's why you have John Richardson on staff to close a high caliber guy like Davon Benjamin.
So, you talk about all the instant impact, and I think that's a big part of it. But I think that this would be as significant of an addition as TI Umu-Cais, because you look at the optics of that. It's a borderline 5-star player who has a crystal ball to Oregon. That is a win, and especially, you and I have talked about the Trent McDuffie player comparisons in terms of how refined he is as a player right now. You take that 11 times out of 10. I don't care about the optics. And it's something I want to actually have a discussion about later on this week, and just tease for the everydayers out there. I want to talk about why people are a little bit, too concerned with how many defensive backs Washington has taken in this class, especially when we, look at Ryan Walters' track record from his time as a defensive coordinator at Illinois in the Big Ten, by the way, just to, just throw that out there. But I think that's something that is certainly worth a discussion later on. And Davon Benjamin is such an important piece of that because, you talk about safety, which is where he's playing right now at Oaks Christian, just so he can be around the ball a little bit more. It does seem like you talk to any evaluator out there that they believe he's going to be a full-time outside cornerback at the next level. And I certainly couldn't disagree with that, like from watching his film. So I think that's a significant part of that, where you think about the optics, you think about everything that goes along with that. Plus, you want an instant impact guy like that. I think Jaron Jones certainly could be that, but Davon Benjamin is just a different level. And you and I have talked about what it takes to continue to expand this recruiting footprint and getting these elite classes in the door every single season. Adding somebody of that caliber is so important for that, because it's just it's all of the on-field stuff is great, but when you're getting 2 of the top 5, top 10 players in California, that's something that can't go understated.
And that's you hit the nail on the head there. It's going back to your West Coast roots. It's one thing to expand into Texas and Florida and your quarterback in New Jersey. It's great. Love it. Like, love the expansion.
Absolutely.
Big 12 or Big 10 expansion was fantastic for Washington because now you're in the party. But you can't forget about the base that got you there, and that's the West Coast and specifically Southern California recruiting. And you just think, like, when you think about UW defensive backs, specifically cornerback, what is the first region of the country that comes to mind?
California.
Yeah, and specifically that LA, Southern California region, we'll just call it, where, you can sprinkle some other guys in from various parts. Like Sonny Zhao is coming in this past weekend for his official from Florida.
But even he's a Southern California guy. Yeah,
again, exactly. So no matter what, somehow all roads lead back to California. Go up I-5, you come to Washington. And I think it makes the most sense.
For all my LA people out there, by the way.
The 5, the 405, it's all great. But with that being said, you're going back to the tradition that got you there, because again, that still plays in the Big 10, Pac-12, Pac-10, whatever conference you're in. Lockdown corners always play.
Especially the lockdown corners that can tackle as well as Davon Benjamin can. Yeah. And that's part of the discussion we want to have on another day, because the last guy you and I wanted to make sure we discussed is another player who's coming off his official visit this weekend. And that's 3-star offensive lineman Pule Primus. This is a kid I'm really, really interested in, because I don't think he's, when you look at Washington's offensive line commits right now, I think he's certainly not on the close end of being ready to compete at the college level at a full time. But I look at his ceiling and I look at the way he plays right now, and it's one of those things where if you look back on this class in 3 or 4 years, if he emerges as the second best player in this offensive line class behind Cody Green, I wouldn't be surprised, because he's just so physical. He plays with such a nasty streak, and it's something where his pass blocking has a long way to go, like a lot of high school offensive linemen. But the traits and everything he brings to the table right now, combined with the, you just talked about it, the ability to expand and go to other places to increase your recruiting footprint. The more you're able to break into Texas, the better. And this is a guy who, he's taken a lot of official visits. He's got just interest from every single corner of the country. If you're able to pull off a win with a kid like that, I think that does a whole lot for, we just spent a whole lot of time talking about how important it is to build up the defensive line in the Big Ten. It's just as important to build up the offensive line. And having a kid like that at 6'4", 325, one of those like real off the bus types where you get off the bus, like he's one of the kids leading the way. And, that's certainly not everything in this day and age, but having as many big physical players like that, especially from that region of the country, you take that 10 times out of 10.
For everything you just said, because again, no notes there, all perfect. And that's why we like Michael Switzer for his D&D draft and development. You sign and develop. Where kind of John Mills, all the guys, even Champs Leah mentioned it when I talked to him. You can see it where it's not the sexiest position obviously to watch it practice, but just watching Michael Switzer coach, you can hear it where he's always giving a player something. And again, this is not to slight another coach. This is just, again, you see the results of where you do this, where Michael Switzer can get along with anybody, whether it's Midland, Texas, Florida, Connecticut, California, Washington, wherever. Like, it literally does not matter. And I think that's what's so imperative, where you look at like, oh, 3-star from Texas. Well, what does that mean? Like if Texas and Texas A&M and SM, all the other schools don't want, it's like, well, not every kid in Texas is going to go to Texas and Texas A&M. There's only 85 spots. Even if they take more guys, they're not just signing the state of Texas. So you look and think, hey, Victor Kern was another guy like that, where Scott Huff went into the state of Texas and Houston and said, you know what? Yeah, he's a tackle, but like I'm going to make that work. And you got to put 18 plus starts out of him at least, or a year and a half as a starter. Did end up transferring to Ole Miss? No. Where did he? Anyways, he transferred out his last year. Shout out to him after the national championship. Was a part of that national championship run when all said and done. So again, getting those guys are just as imperative as any other, when you look at it from proximity, as anybody else.
No, absolutely. And it's something where if you're able to continually go in and just take a player or two out of the state of Texas, there's never going to be a bad thing with that, whether they work out or not. And I believe that, somebody like that just fits everything that you want to do so well along the offensive line that, you look at the plan 2, 3, 4 years down the line, there's certainly a spot for a kid like that, even as a 6th offensive lineman in a jumbo package. Like there are so many different ways that you can find a way to just utilize that level of physicality and just find ways to make it work, because that's just what Jedd Fisch and, this entire coaching staff have found ways to do very, very well. Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all of you dares for tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming at you throughout the offseason, so please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, we're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day, so make sure you click that like button, click that little bell, so you never miss when we post new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comments section. And if you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review, as it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Wednesday.